And so the answer to the question, what is a life worth living, cannot be dependent on somebody else, cannot be dependent on living for your grandchild so that you can see them become a doctor. What if the grandchild never wants to become a doctor and they drop out of medical school? Then is your life now worthless? What if your family rejects you? Is then your life worthless? So the answer cannot be dependent on other people. The answer is a life is worth living so long as you are living virtuously in spite of suffering, and you live this life detached to the good and to the bad, to the ups and to the downs. Your life is worth living because you are living virtuously. I hope you're enjoying this podcast, and if you are, please consider signing up and supporting my work on Substack or on Patreon by clicking the link in the description. And help me get this in front of like-minded people by sharing it with your friends, your families, and leave a 5-star review on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, or subscribing with the bell if you're on YouTube. Let's get into this episode. My father had cerebellar ataxia, which has made it virtually impossible for him to walk. He also has late-stage dementia, which makes it hard for him to remember things, enjoy eating various foods, and take care of basic bodily functions. In spite of all the difficulty he faces, his will to survive is strong. He regularly points out to me that during his struggle with ataxia and dementia, he has survived the loss of my mother to cancer, 2 types of cancer, and a major pandemic. He says that what keeps him going is the enjoyment he gets from engaging with his family and wanting to see his only grandchild become a medical doctor. In my previous piece, The Ethics of Suicide, I mused that if I were in my father's situation, I might choose to end my life because of the inability to function in the world in ways I desire to. But I also made it clear that I couldn't be certain how likely I would be to end my life because I am not in my dad's situation, nor have I been in any situation that is similar enough to make my musing more than speculative. Things have changed. I have now been diagnosed with late-stage stomach cancer. The statistics say I only have a 6% chance of being alive in 5 years. The stomach cancer has already caused 2 strokes. I live with a gut-brain paradox. If you treat the stroke, then you might cause bleeding in my stomach. If you treat the stomach cancer, you might increase the probability of a stroke. My 2 strokes have compromised my left hand's functionality. I am currently undergoing aggressive cancer treatment. The doctor says that if I don't treat the cancer, I would probably only live for another 2 months without debilitating discomfort. It has always been jarring to me when a reporter jabs a microphone up to someone who, say, is being wheeled out of their still burning home and asks, "Can you tell us how you feel right now?" How do you think they feel? That is to say that this essay is not about my feeling regarding my diagnosis. Feelings are important. Some would argue there is nothing more important, but that is not my focus here. There is no escaping the question, what matters most to me? What should I do? I cannot shake off deciding on these questions with the thought, I can always figure this out later. Time is not on my side. Naturally, some of the questions that arise have to do with what quality of life I wish to live in for the remainder of my time. We can naturally distinguish between 3 things: being alive to do what one wants to do, having the capacity to do what one wants to do, and having the means to do what one wants to do. Some people are alive and have the capacity to do what they want to do. If they want to go for a walk by themselves, they can do. Some people are alive and have the capacity to do what they want to do, but don't have the means to do what they want to do. They could physically go on a trip around the world, but they lack the monetary means to do so. And then there are those who have the monetary means to do almost anything they want to do, but lack this physical or mental capacity to do most things. When one thinks about the kind of life they want to live, when they have a terminal illness. It is clear that time till death, functional capacity, and monetary means all matter in selecting how to spend what time they have left. But there are moral questions as well. This is an excerpt from the essay Terminal Illness and Transformative Experience by Anand Vaidya. Anand was a professor of philosophy. And in this essay, Anand is reflecting on his terminal illness, which is late-stage stomach cancer, and some of the philosophical implications of living with the knowledge of his impending death. And he explores all the ways in which this knowledge that he has impacts his quality of life, the decisions that he makes, the questions that he has around adoption, whether he should adopt, the impact that this has on his relationship. Ultimately, he's exploring how he should spend the rest of his time. And it is an interesting essay to read, and I only came across this recently, because what you have is an academic philosopher engaging in what for him becomes the most important questions to deal with. Right? And it is, what does he do with the time that he has now been allotted with? You and I and everybody in this world are guaranteed one thing in life, and that is death. Death does not discriminate between old, young, poor and rich, smart and stupid. Death comes to all living beings that are born. So the question is, and has always been, how should we live our lives in this knowledge? And the reality is that for many of us, we never want to think about death because it's a terrifying thought that one day you and I might not be here, that one day our children will be without their parents, that one day our spouses will be without us. And so instead we focus on trivial things, things that distract us from meditating upon our death, until something like this happens, until, like in the case of Anand, he is diagnosed with late-stage stomach cancer, and he's only been given a few years, and at worst, only a few months. And Anand passed away recently. And when we look at this essay, he opens it with his father being diagnosed with cerebellar ataxia, which impacts his motor functions, and it makes it very difficult to do anything. And his father, not only does he have that, he also lost his wife. He had 2 types of cancer, but his father tells Anand that the reason he is continuing to persist is because of his enjoyment from being with family. But most importantly, it is actually to see his only grandchild become a doctor. And so keep this in mind, because we'll return to this last part later on. And the interesting thing with Anand is he acknowledges that prior to him actually being diagnosed with cancer, he didn't really have any skin in the game. He had written an essay called The Ethics of Suicide, contemplating his father's illness and trying to analyze that from the perspective of Kant's deontology, Mill's utilitarianism, and Jain religious tradition. And as I read in the excerpt, he mused that if he were in his father's situation, he might have actually ended his own life because of his inability to function properly in this world. But says, I'm not my father and I'm not in that situation, so I actually don't know. And that is absolutely correct. But for him, things changed after he was diagnosed with late-stage stomach cancer. And now he has skin in the game. There's no more abstract philosophizing, intellectually discussing whether one would kill themselves or not, whether one would continue to live. None of that is there anymore. He meaning Anand, is confronted with the reality that he is going to die very soon. And he's stuck because now, if he treats his stomach cancer, then there's an increase in probability of getting a stroke. If he treats a stroke, then it might cause bleeding in his stomach. He's already lost his left hand. He cannot move it properly because of the stroke. And at this point, when he's writing this essay, he's going through an aggressive cancer treatment. And it is clear that Anand does not want to die because he writes, the doctor says that if I don't treat the cancer, I would probably only live for another 2 months without debilitating discomfort. And this reminded me of something that Paul Kalanithi, an episode that we've done, is a book called When Breath Becomes Air. Paul is a respected neurosurgeon. He also has late stage cancer. He dies after 22 months from his diagnosis. And Paul writes, death comes for all of us. For us, for our patients, it is our fate as living, breathing, metabolizing organisms. Most lives are lived with passivity towards death. It's something that happens to you and those around you. And similarly, for Paul Kalanithi, he had assumed that he had confronted his death because he spent quite a few years immersing himself in the literature on mortality, on how to live well. But it was only when death was at his door that he really began to contemplate truly, because then you see how his life changed. And so in this case with Anand, he is also confronted and gripped for the first time, even though his father has been grappling through these questions for a while. And even though Anand has written an essay on what he would do if he was in his father's situation, it was only after he became sick and diagnosed that he realized, I actually am going to die. And in that moment, all the things that are important to him surface up. He starts to ask the important questions. So he writes, there is now no escaping the question, what matters most to me? What should I do? I cannot shake off deciding on these questions with the thought, I can always figure this out later. Time is not on my side. And this question that he asks, what matters most to me? What should I do? These have always been some of the most important questions of our lives. It's only that in this situation with Anand, his impending death cleared away the fog, cleared away the distraction, cleared away all the noise that we fill our lives with. And for the first time, he can see very, very clearly that perhaps many of the things that he has spent his life doing were not the most important things. Otherwise, you wouldn't ask this question, right? You wouldn't ask the question, what is most important to me? What matters most to me? What should I do? If you were doing those things already. And this is one of the most obvious distinctions that exists between, say, religious monks, spiritual sages, and those who are focused on other things that are non-spiritual, that are more materialistic oriented. What we end up finding when we're reading some of these spiritual sages, when we're reading works from, say, from Thich Nhat Hanh, or say of Thomas Merton, or of any of the sages that we've read, they never ask themselves, what matters most to me? What should I be doing now that death is going to come to me? Thich Nhat Hanh, famously, when he got sick and he could no longer speak, he never said or communicated to his fellow monks that he's in the wrong, quote-unquote, profession, in the wrong vocation. He actually traveled back to the original monastery in which he was initiated, and he died there. And this is the way that you and I should live our lives. This is the way we should function, where when death comes to us, if we are ever diagnosed with late-stage cancer, we shouldn't be asking, what matters most to me? What should I do? Because we should already be doing those things then and before the diagnosis. And so when the diagnosis happens to us, our lives really never change. It's just that our death has come closer and we're just going to be passing away much sooner than we thought. But in the situation with Anand, because he has cancer, he already had a stroke, he was now limited with his functionality. And that's why he says about how we can distinguish between three things when you're alive: is being alive and being able to do what you want to do, 2, having the capacity to do what you want to do, and 3, having the means to do what you want to do. And that's why he goes on to say, well, you could have the capacity to do what you want to do, but you might not have the monetary means. Or you could have the monetary means, but have no physical or mental capacity to execute on these things. And one of those things is his struggle, his conflict, because he has a desire for children. But this conflicts with his very real case that he's going to die very soon. So he writes, "For example, I have some time, the means, and some capacity to adopt a child during my terminal illness, something I have thought about for a long time before my illness became known. However, I should ask, would it be moral for me to do this, knowing that I would be rendering my child fatherless in a few years? On the one hand, it seems that I could do a great deal of benefit to a child that currently lacks a family. On the other hand, I could inflict even more harm on a child that already has suffered from lack of stable family. Choosing how to spend one's remaining time is not all that different from choosing how to spend one's time. The moral questions are omnipresent." Right here, when he says choosing how to spend one's remaining time is not at all that different from choosing how to spend one's time. Because he has thought about adopting a child for a very long time, even before his terminal illness, and it is only that the terminal illness made it clear to him that that desire is one of his strongest desires. We don't actually know if he ends up adopting, but it sounds like he doesn't end up adopting a child. And so questions like these are what happens when we confront our mortality, when we face our mortality. And that is why it's crucial that it is an activity that we do as frequently as possible. It doesn't have to be every single day that you're contemplating on your mortality. The famous saying, memento mori, right? Remember your death, that the Stoics use, that was actually very common within the early Christian church, memento mori. It is something that refocuses our attention on those things that are not ephemeral, that are not transient, on those things that are lasting, and some would even say everlasting. And in regards to this idea of confronting your death and being in Anand's situation, being diagnosed with cancer, what it does, it has this transformative experience for him. In his situation, this knowledge of his death transforms his life. And I quote, Rebecca Chan, who I assume is another academic, offers a nice account of Laurie Paul's position on transformative experience. On Paul's view, transformative experience are those that radically change the person that has the experience in an epistemic and personal way. When a person transforms epistemically, they gain knowledge of what the experience is like that they could not have had without the experience. And then he goes on to give the example of love, where you could know about what it's like to fall in love, what it's like to be with the person that you love. But it is only when you fall in love, it is only when you actually are spending time with the person that you love that you experience what that is like. It goes from abstract to direct knowledge. And in this situation, the terminology they use is it becomes a transformative experience. And I quote, experiences like falling in love that transform people both epistemically and personally are transformative experiences. When I was reading this, I was chuckling because it once again is another case in point where academics think that they have stumbled upon something grand and insightful, like coming up with this new phrase, transformative experience, when in reality, this idea that they're explicating has always been the case within almost all of the ancient wisdom literature that we've looked at. It's funny how academics make something simple and plain and intuitive more complex than it needs to be, where they write whole papers on the differences between direct knowledge and abstract knowledge, and then only then can it be a real thing once it's been explained. But you don't need an academic paper or a journal article to tell you that there's a difference between direct knowledge and abstract knowledge. And in this situation, it's clear that Anand, for all the writings that he's done on death, he comes to understand that there is a chasm between direct knowledge, experiential knowledge, and abstractly discussing ideas through articles and essays. And that is an important understanding to come to, because without that understanding, we can easily become caught up in our high tower. We can easily become focused purely on the intellectual life and become what the samurais call a rotten vegetable. And for the samurais, if you remember the episode we've done with Inato when he's going through the Bushido, he says for samurais, Somebody who collects knowledge are no different than a machine who can just spit out answers when you give them answers, but they don't really understand what it is. And the samurais view somebody who is purely focused on knowledge acquisition. And the desert monks that we've also looked at have this idea of the intellectual, the one who has no direct knowledge of what it is they speak about. And mind you, these desert knowledge are religious. And so they're talking about love and they're talking about God. They say that somebody who can talk about love and speak eloquently about God and tell you all the doctrinal differences between X, Y, and Z, but actually have no love, are like clothes that you fold and stuff in a trunk and lock it. Over time, those clothes are going to rot. And just like clothes rotting, having knowledge about love and having knowledge about God and all these other things, if you don't actually put them into practice, if those abstract knowledge never become direct, never have a transformative experience, then you are like rotting clothes inside of a trunk. And this is absolutely true. And death is one of the catalysts for making us realize this. Death is the great awakening. Mortality, confronting our death, is the great awakening. Or either you can live like you'll never die, as many of us do, or as we've talked about before in many other episodes, we must confront death before we die. And so Anand writes, death is the ultimate transformative experience. And then he goes on to talk about this other author, Evan Thompson, and I quote, holds that it is personally transformative because it changes how you experience yourself in ways that you cannot fully grasp before these things happen. He's referring to death here. And he, Evan, states that death is unlike any other transformative experience. It is the ultimate one, not only in being final, inevitable, and all-encompassing, but also in having fundamental significance. When we spend even a fraction of our time contemplating death versus wasting our time scrolling on social media or wasting our time going to useless events and trying to impress other people, if we spend a fraction of that time contemplating on our death, we'll soon realize that it is one of the most important things to do because it transforms us. It makes us see reality as it is, because death is final. It is inevitable. It fundamentally changes the way you act because you realize that many of the things that we take for granted as important start to fade away. As we saw in the case with Leo Tolstoy, as we saw in the case with Viktor Frankl, as we saw in the case with Paul Kalanithi, as we've seen in the case with many of the other ancient sages, they all view death as a catalyst for great change in our lives. They might have differing views on what happens after death, but death is a portal of some sort to them. A portal where once you've confronted your death, you can see the world in a new way. And you start to live life the way that you should, the way that is true to you, the way that you feel is honest, is right. Balthazar Garcian, another author that we've looked at, he writes something along the lines of, philosophy is contemplating on your death daily to do it well once. Now, Anand goes on to write, if you have a terminal illness, you know you are going to die. But when you die, there is no repeating it. On non-afterlife accounts of death, death is not an experience, since a subject only exists before and at best partially during the experience, but not after the experience. Rather than death, it is the knowledge of terminal illness that one lives through. It is living with the knowledge of impending death that structures how the knowledge transforms one. The first step to confronting our mortality is not whether there is life after death. That defeats the point of confronting your death. Because if you think there's life after death, even if there is, you might live your life willy-nilly because you think you can repeat it again another time. And so the first step to confronting your death is not entertaining whether there's something after death, but confronting this life, confronting this death, here and now, and then living our lives according to it, according to the knowledge that there is no repeating this life. And once you've done that, then we can entertain whether there's life after death. But I think the mistake that many make when confronting their death is they believe that there is a heaven, that there is a hell, that they believe that there's some sort of afterlife. And so they'll live their life here, not taking anything seriously, not loving deeply, not forgiving, not doing any of the things that are meaningful and true, right? And are directed to the good, because they have the option to redo it in another life, whether that's in their belief of the karmic cycle or in heaven and hell. I mentioned in the episode with Paul Kalanithi that we all have a terminal illness. It's not just these people who are diagnosed with cancer that have terminal illness. In reality, we all have a terminal illness. It's just that these guys happen to know when their death is happening because of their cancer. And the terminal illness is death. The cancer is not the death. Death is the death. Everyone is going to die. If you are born, you will die. You can never escape death. And you don't need a terminal illness to realize this. And more importantly, you don't need to do any sort of analysis on how the impending death can be transformative. Just confront your death daily. Sometimes we avoid confronting death by pretending that we are confronting death through our analysis of what death is. But confronting death and then analyzing what death is are two separate things. When we confront our death, it changes the way we live our lives. Right? We focus on the things that are most important to us. We don't ask, what is important to me? What shall I do? Because we are already doing it, or we should already be doing these things. And so Anand writes, the knowledge of terminal illness transforms one not by disrupting the background knowledge, but by bringing into relief the background knowledge as it calls out for one to reflect on their lives, on their life projects. Knowledge of terminal illness is intimately connected to the personal aspect of transformative experience. And he's right here. It brings to the forefront the background knowledge that we've always ignored or thought that we've had time to look at. And it makes us reflect on our life projects. I like the way he put that. And then in the same paragraph, he goes on to say, we just don't know when, meaning when we'll die. We also reasonably believe that those older than us are likely to die before us. However, none of this third-person perspective knowledge puts us in an intimate relationship with our own death. The terminality of terminal illness gives us an imminent, phenomenal, first personal acquaintance with an impending state of affairs. The knowledge of this terminality, given that it concerns the final existence, is deeply transformative. And so what Anand is emphasizing is the transformative experience that death brings forth. And he's right. For many of us, knowing that we will die doesn't factor into our lives. And this is because many of us keep this knowledge at a distant, like a third-person perspective. Oh, yeah, IJ will die, but he'll die in 80 years. And that IJ and this IJ are 40 years apart, so we won't even think about it. And for Anand, it is only when it goes from third person to first person that it becomes real, that it becomes transformative. When I realize that the IJ who will die 40 years from now, 50 years from now, is the same IJ that is living today. And when you can bridge that chasm in your mind, we break this illusion that we will never die. And when we do that, you start asking questions like, and I'm quoting, what is a life worth living? Knowledge of a terminal illness leads to this question as well because of the intimate connection that one has temporally to time they have left. We are temporal creatures. We live in time. The biggest lie we tell ourselves is that we'll somehow live forever. Through companies, through our children, through our work, through building a nation, through becoming president, through becoming prime minister, through becoming all these things, we think we will live forever. And right now, we are obsessed with longevity, on how to live as long as possible healthy, how to maybe potentially live for 100 extra years. Because all of us, no matter how big we get, no matter how successful we get, we are all terrified of death. And in our fear, we try to prolong this life. But what we actually do is we become attached. And when we become attached, we end up creating more suffering for ourselves and suffering for the world around us. It is the attachment that causes more suffering, and the suffering is what we're trying to avoid. And so what is a life worth living? A life worth living is one that is focused on cultivating virtues. And that is a theme that has come up again and again through all of these books that we've looked at. And Anand goes on to ask this question: what suffering is worth undergoing? And when we ask the question, what is a life worth living, we need to transcend the individual. My dad clearly thinks the question of suffering is worth undergoing is answered by who he is living for, his family and grandchild. So what is a life worth living? For Anand, it is living for others. Right? He gives the example of his dad, who has survived 2 cancers, the death of his wife, his cerebral ataxia, because he's living for his family and for his grandchild. And to be very specific, to see his grandchild become a doctor. Anand goes on to talk about how for him a life worth living is for the whom. And so he writes, the for whom for me is more widely drawn compared to his father and compared to his friend Victor, including those whom I shared goals and values in history. But that answer, what is a life worth living, cannot be answered by saying a life worth living is living for others. Because then you are not living at all, because you are trapped on the opposite side of the scale of trying to impress people, of trying to do all these things. But now you're on the opposite side of saying, oh, I'm living and surviving through this terminal illness for somebody else. Suppose that somebody else rejects you, the person that you're living for. Then you no longer have any more reason to live. And so the answer to the question, what is a life worth living, cannot be dependent on somebody else. Cannot be dependent on living for your grandchild so that you can see them become a doctor. What if the grandchild never wants to become a doctor and they drop out of medical school? Then is your life now worthless? What if your family rejects you? Is then your life worthless? So the answer cannot be dependent on other people. The answer is a life is worth living so long as you are living virtuously in spite of suffering, and you live this life detached to the good and to the bad, to the ups and to the downs. Your life is worth living because you are living virtuously and you are living harmoniously with what is true and what is good. That is a life worth living. Now, Anand goes on to say, one of the things that for him would probably make his life not worth living is if there's too much pain, right? So I quote, "It is clear to me that I prefer to exist without lots of pain, with the capacity to take care of basic bodily functions, and with the capacity to use my mind. What is unclear is how much pain and lack of basic functioning I can endure with the hope of possibly recovering those capacities or finding new ways of being." Many of us would like to live painless lives. We, as creatures, seek comfort. Most of our lives are spent avoiding pain. And when we encounter pain, we seek medication. So we always assume pain is bad, as in this case, right? Anand wants to live in a world without lots of pain. But it's important to realize that pain is not bad in reality. When we look at pain, it is what alerts us that something is happening to us or something has happened to us, whether that's good or bad. Take 2 examples here. First, you have leprosy. Leprosy is bad because it prevents us from feeling pain. When we can't feel pain, we go and hurt ourselves because there's no indication. We don't know that we're hurting ourselves because there's no pain. Right? We learn, for example, not to put our hands on hot stove because of the pain that we experienced previously. However, if there were no pain receptors in our hands, and the pain receptors were, say, not working, we'll burn our hand right through. And so pain within our own body functions as a way for us to function well in this world. Second example that I can think of is pain that you feel after you work out, after you do any sort of intensive exercise. When you've done that, the following morning and the day after, your body will feel sore, right? It might be more difficult to walk. But the soreness is not a bad thing, right? It's an indication that we've worked on building up strength in those areas, and so your body is repairing and becoming stronger there. So again, pain here is happening because there's growth. Similarly, This is why pain, when I was reading this, it made me think pain is not a bad thing, even though we always try to avoid it. We can't be sadistic about pain, obviously, and seek out pain for the sake of pain, but pain is necessary for growth. And we shouldn't prefer a world where there is no pain. And Anand is not saying he prefers a world where there is no pain. He's saying, I prefer to exist without lots of pain. But it made me want to specify that pain is not bad. We avoid pain because we are living in a very comfortable world. But most of our growth, most of the things that we do involve pain. And whether that's growing, whether that's getting stronger, whether that's learning not to put hands on hot stoves, pain is there because it's good. Now, near the end of this essay, he writes, "What has become salient to me through my knowledge of terminal illness that is a transformative experience is that I don't have time for all the projects I want to do. I have to decide, for example, what philosophical tasks I want to accomplish in this time. One way to put it is this: what self should I favor?" And that is a question for us as well, for us as we contemplate and reflect on our death. What are the things that we want to focus our time on? And when we can become clear on that, then it'll become much easier to say no to distracting things, no to the voices in our head that daily try to pull us away from the important things. And for Anand, as an academic, he wants to spend his time researching, but he's also married, and he's conflicted with whether he should spend time with his wife, go on walks, or spend time in his philosophical research. So he writes, "I'm not certain that my ideas in either of these projects will terminate in profound philosophy, but my motivation here are philosophically honest. Still, might it be time to focus on personal projects and accomplishments outside of intellectual pursuits? For example, going to Patagonia or hiking the John Muir Trail with my wife. How does one decide such things? The temporal dimension of terminal illness is salient, and it matters. How much time one has matters for what they can accomplish. There is urgency that is neither diminished by working faster nor more often, because the urgency concerns finality without further qualification. The telos, the final goal, the purpose of our life is not our accomplishments and all the prizes that we can stack up in a cupboard, but rather if we have lived virtuously despite our suffering and ailments, because this life is filled with suffering. And so the goal, again, is whether our lives are oriented towards the good, towards truth, towards the things that are important. So when we return to why Anand's father continued to live despite his ataxia, it was because, and I quote, the enjoyment he gets from engaging with his family and wanting to see his only grandchild become a medical doctor. It's his desire for his grandchild to achieve a status of being a doctor. The desire is so strong that it allows his father to continue and persist through the death of his wife, the 2 types of cancer, and to not give up. But it's all this for a fleeting moment where your grandchild is conferred the title of being a medical doctor. And so this is a reminder of 2 things. One is good and the other is misguided. The good is that it totally is up to us to determine whether we can withstand the storms of this life, how much suffering we can endure, how much pain we can endure. And Anand's father is a testament to the human spirit that we can endure a tremendous amount of suffering, a tremendous amount of pain. And there's that quote from Nietzsche, which goes along the lines of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But the flip side of this is we must be careful not to get misguided for what the good is. In this case, Anand's father holds out for something transient, ephemeral to take place, which is to see his grandchild become a doctor, taking only what Anand is writing. We don't see that his father is focused on cultivating the virtue, pursuing the good. Rather, he's focused on status. And Leo Tolstoy famously learned this lesson the hard way. Right? He had everything. He had the fame, he had the wealth, he had the women, he had the high status, he had the mansion, he had the acreage. He thought life was about all of this. But at the age of 50, he becomes deeply depressed and on the verge of suicide. So severe was his depression that he refused to go hunting because he was afraid he was going to shoot himself. And in this darkness, he comes and stumbles upon the realization that he has been living his life out of vanity. And in his vanity, he confused what was important with what was trivial. And this life, Tolstoy ends up concluding, is about living directed towards the good, towards focusing on the eternal aspects. With that, the challenges for today are: 1, meditate upon your death. It is coming for all of us. None of us will escape it, even though technology promises everlasting life. How do you meditate upon death? If I die today, what would I have done differently? What should I do that I know I should do but have been putting off? Is it to mend a broken relationship? When death is before us, what is important becomes very, very clear. The second thing is to focus on the intangible things of life. And I say intangible because these are things like love, patience, kindness, forgiveness, grace, courage. If our lives are filled with these, we have already defeated death. We have overcome the illusion, and we are living in the truth. And the third one is to not get misguided for what it is that we are living for. And with that, I'll wrap. Thank you for listening to this episode. I appreciate you. If you're not already subscribed, do subscribe to the podcast. And if you enjoy my work and want to support it, head over to Substack or on Patreon and become a paying member. Until next week, peace.